Choosing the 8 most important events in history is one of the most difficult and controversial things to do. Why? Because history is more than a few hundred years long, and there is way too much bias in most lists. I've attempted to create a list without that bias, that manages to touch on the major events in history that ended up shaping the world. Some of the events were huge, yet impacted only a continent or two. Others literally touched every culture and brought them into a whole new way of thinking. Here is my humble attempt at the 8 most important events in history. 8. Poor funding has undermined Britain's dream of winning the space race. The space race was a strenuous scientific confrontation between the world's superpowers. Russia managed to get a man to orbit the moon, while the United States brought the man to the moon, but both seem to have been defeated by a new and unexpected rival at the same time. A funding agreement was signed for this program. It is likely that the first man who would orbit the space or land on the moon had to be from the British nation. It is estimated that Britain's men could have had access to space in 1951 at the latest. That would have happened if the UK Ministry of Finance had agreed to sign the budget for the project. In December 1946, Britain was bankrupt. Working to bring the country back to normal rather than sending men into space, funding for the project was completely cancelled in early 1947. After a careful study, and the nascent space program in the UK was abandoned. 7. The American Revolution. To many, this event was too localized to be considered part of a list that involves all of history. Yet the shockwaves from this one event are still felt today. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, took many ideas from the early civilizations of Greece and Rome and combined them with the Christian Bible to revolt against an authority that was unbending. They believed that every man, though at the time even that statement was narrowly defined, was equal and should be treated fairly. Only when the men and women of the New World rose up together was there a solid foundation for the beginning of a nation that in our modern world influences much around the globe. When an election is held in the United States, the world watches. The influence that America now has gives credence to the American Revolution, being one of the greatest events in our history. 6. The Reformation. The Reformation, 1517 to 1648, was one of the greatest events in European history. Prior to this period, the Roman Catholic Church had close to absolute control over the people and governments of the Christian world. It was when many of the learned men of the time began to question the practices of the Church in comparison to the Bible that trouble arose. The intent of the Reformation was to reform the Catholic Church and bring it back to its biblical roots. The end result was a rending of the Church into 2 factions, Catholics and Protestants. The Reformation brought the religious texts into the hands of the masses and began the decline of the Catholic power. Both the wars it caused and the actions of the famous historical figures it involved still continue to shape the world today. Thinking of this only as a European event could be erroneous. Because of the Reformation, much of the New World, known as the Americas, was shaped. Missionaries increased in number throughout the world, and thinkers who rose up from the Renaissance could proclaim their discoveries and beliefs with less fear of persecution. The Reformation gave us free thought while holding us down to the basics of life. 5. The Renaissance. Nothing can compare to the age of the Renaissance. Ignorance was being pushed aside, and the world was beginning to see the mathematics of a falling apple, the sparkle of a dewdrop, and the wonder of a distant star. It was during this time that great men and women questioned tradition and standing beliefs. People learned that there was still a lot to learn in this great world. The Earth was not the center of the universe. There were planets besides our own. There was a world of mathematics that had functioned just under the surface where no man had yet looked. There was beauty in colors that art began to acknowledge and share with the world. The Renaissance gave us new light, pushing aside the Dark Ages when man was directed by superstition and fear. The Renaissance gave the unexplainable a face and a name. There would be no more fear. Curiosity was encouraged despite opposition from those that longed to remain in the past. 4. Atomic Bomb Hiroshima. The U.S. atomic bombs of 1945 devastated the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation finally brought the Japanese to surrender, bringing to an end a fierce and costly Pacific War. The surrender of Japan had, at one time, seemed unthinkable, but the atomic bomb hastened the Japanese surrender. The atomic bomb had implications beyond just the end of the Second World War. It showed the world the potential devastation a Third World War could cause. Even now, the legacy of Hiroshima and the threat of nuclear war hangs over the world. 3. Computer and Internet. Alan Turing first mentioned the principle of the modern computer, and later the first mechanical computer was invented in the early 19th century. This invention has indeed accomplished amazing things in more areas of life than we realize. It has helped high-performance military aircraft to fly, put a spaceship into orbit, control medical equipment, create visual imagery, store vast amounts of information, and allow the functioning of cars, phones, and power plants. The Internet was first developed in 1973 by Vinton Cerf, backed by the U.S. Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. Its first use was to provide a network of communication within research labs and universities within the United States, and expanded over time. This invention, along with the World Wide Web, has been the foremost revolutionary invention of the 20th century. In 1996, more than 25 million computers were connected through the Internet across 180 countries. 2. World War II. This is one of the few wars that literally involved most of the world. The scarring from this 6-year fight is still seen today in the demolished buildings and the tattooed numbers on the arms of POWs. There was no main objective or enemy. There was no main front. It was composed of the European, African, and Asian segments of the war. It ripped through every economic level, race, religion, and culture. Country after country fell into other hands. Men, women, and children were killed by the millions. Many lost their loved ones and had to seek new lands to call home, as there was so much devastation. World War II also led to the creation of the United Nations, a homeland for the Jews, and the beginning of the Cold War. The world had changed, and was never to return to the innocence it once claimed. It was the unmasking of an underlying evil that took an ugly shape in the Cold War. Only as the truth of the massacres, plots, and campaigns have revealed themselves has the world truly begun to heal. 1. The life of Muhammad. Just like the life of Jesus, whether you are a follower of Muhammad, 570 to 630, or not, you cannot deny the impact his life has had on history. Before Muhammad rose up as the founder of Islam, the Middle East was full of small tribes that warred against each other continuously. Muhammad brought those tribes together and gave them a purpose and a reason to join forces. After Muhammad brought together the Middle East, the region experienced the Islamic Golden Age from 786 to 1258. This time is analogous to Europe's Renaissance, though during this time, Europe was still in the Dark Ages. The region's culture flourished and made many advances in fields, including mathematics and science. The world benefited from Muslims' discoveries of the immune system, preservation of Roman and Greek texts, and invention of the number 0, the decimal system, and algebra. Even coffee was discovered during the Islamic Golden Age. The stability Muhammad brought to the region was one of the reasons that the culture was able to make such advances. Since the birth of Islam, it has become one of the largest religions of the world. It covers the globe, and through many of its sects, it has influenced the world. The terrorist branches have reached out and impacted the daily lives of every person through their traveling procedures or just the way they go to work with extra security. Muhammad changed the shape of the Middle East that is still changing today.